Welcome back. I'm Connie Sokol, your host of Called to Create. And today, I cannot tell you how excited I am to interview our guest, Gerald Lund. Gerald, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We are so thrilled. I told him a little bit before, I'm kind of trying not to fangirl because I've been reading his works forever, just like many, many, many of you who are listening. So although you know his backstory, I'm going to give the official bio, but then we are going to add in a few little things. And we're going to dive right into some of those questions that you know you want to ask and find out about how he does the miracles that he does with writing. It is incredible. To begin with, Gerald Lund is among the most read authors in LDS church literature. His publications have sold about 3.5 million copies over the years. And he is unusual in this way in that he's equally successful in fiction and nonfiction works, which really is an incredible feat. He received his BA and MS degrees from BYU and did extensive graduate work in New Testament studies at Pepperdine University and studied Hebrew at the University of Judaism. And he has also done a variety of callings for the church. During his 35 years in the church educational system, Brother Lund has served as a seminary teacher, institute teacher and director, curriculum writer, director of college curriculum, and zone administrator. His church callings have included stake president, bishop, and he also served as a member of the Second Quorum of the 70 from 2002 to 2008. And one of the things that I love about the information from him as we were doing research is that he has this beautiful quote, and he says, "I write because I love to teach. Writing is just another form of teaching, but with a much bigger and more diverse class." I want to dive right into that. Okay, tell me where that comes from. Where did you first start seeing this seed of this gift, this teaching gift or desire? Where did you first start noticing or feeling this?
I thought about that a lot, actually, and this is a little complicated, but let me take a minute to kind of give the background. In my family, every Sunday dinner, we'd have a prayer, and then somebody would throw out a topic, gospel or politics or whatever, and then we'd just go at it as we ate. That was just kind of our style. And what if it was a gospel? This is, of course, when we're all older, my two older brothers and so on. If it was a gospel topic and somebody said something, well, the Bible says this, or the Doctrine and Covenants says this, my dad would always say chapter and verse. In other words, if you can't back it up, don't quote it. And so I think that's where that basic desire came. But when I was in the mission field, one day my companion and I were invited to a couple's house, and there were 3 families there just for dinner with the missionaries. And afterwards, one of the brethren there said, "Hey, I got some really exciting stuff I just received from some relative in Salt Lake City." And it turned out that he had 2 prophecies. One by Joseph Smith called the White Horse Prophecy, which many people know about that one. Another one that was called the Horseshoe Prophecy, supposedly from President John Taylor. And he read these, and they're pretty sensational, all kinds of promises, and we're all just shaking our heads thinking, wow, this is really something. So when he was finished, and this is really cocky of me now that I think about it, but I said, how valid are those? I mean, do these come from really solid sources? When he says, of course they do, Joseph Smith and John Taylor. I said, well, just because they got their name on it doesn't prove anything. And he said, well, I just assume it's true. Now, I still don't know how I knew this. This really surprised me as I've tried to think back on it. But I knew that back then, Joseph Fielding Smith, who was at that point president of the Quorum of the 12, took questions from members of the church, just opened it up. You could write a letter to him anytime, ask him any questions, and he would actually answer them personally.
Wow.
You may be aware that later they published 5 volumes, kind of small volumes, of all of those questions. Somehow I knew that. And so I said to this guy, I said, why don't you send it to President Smith in Salt Lake and have him respond to it? And he gave me this funny look and he said, I would never do that. No one would ever do that. And I said, I would, because that's how I grew up. So he made me a copy of the one, and the other one, the horseshoe, was short, but the white horse is quite long. So I enclosed the horseshoe in my letter and then described the other one to President Smith. 2 weeks later, I got an envelope in the mail. First thing he chided me on was for not putting a stamp on my return envelope. I didn't know that was required. Secondly, on the horseshoe prophecy, he sent it back to me, and it was just right across the middle of the page, there was this big X. And then in the margin, he said, throw this in the trash, JFS. That was pretty clear. And then on my letter concerning the white horse prophecy, he said, this is garbage. And that was it. And so I shared that with them. They were greatly disappointed. The one said, I still believe him. But I somehow in there, maybe even later when I come back to BYU, I decided I wanted to know, kind of start a collection of both scriptures and quotes by the brethren about the last days and the second coming and, the signs of the times, all of that. So I just started that and when I found something, I put it in a file. Then I was transferred to California to teach in the Institute. That's when I went to Pepperdine. And that interest continued. When I was at BYU, I all spent a lot of time at the BYU library looking for those kind of quotes and sources in the books there. So I get down there, and which is very common, seminary and institute teachers are always asked to speak at firesides or teach classes and so on. And so since this was an interest, I began talking about this and quoting and using these sources that were pretty solid. And to my surprise, over and over, people would say, wow, where did you get those quotes? My answer was not very helpful, but it was true. And I said, at BYU library. And one guy said, well, that doesn't help me. And then he said, why don't you write a book? I just laughed. But that happened several times. And one of those firesides, my wife was there, and on the way home, she said, why don't you? This interests you so much, why don't you? And that was the beginning of my first book, which was The Coming of the Lord.
Yeah.
Written, published just 51 years ago now. So.
And isn't it in its second edition now? That just was released?
It's still out, but of course, we'll talk about this a little more. I did a major revision of it, basically a redo, a couple of years ago. But out of that, and that was handwritten. This was before word processors, and I didn't have a typewriter at that, so I hand wrote it, and lots of scribbles, and my wife typed it. And we submitted it, and the first place we submitted it, it was turned down. They said, we think this book has promise, but our publication schedule is full. I was just shattered. I'd put in all that work, and now they said no. And one of my colleagues prints some of his own. And so I sent him a letter, and he sent it right back and said, this is not the kind of thing I do, but Bookcraft would do it. Send it to them. I sent it to Bookcraft, and a week later, they said they were interested, and that's how it came to be.
I love it.
And that was my writing beginning. I'm often asked, so have you ever taken a writing class? I hesitate because the answer is no, not of any kind. But I've always worried that people say, oh, so that explains a lot.
That explains it. Okay, I'm going to stop you right there because I cannot believe you have not had a class on timelining things and how to keep all of the characters straight and all of those things. Then what's your genius in doing that? What is your process work in the glory? Just thinking of all the families and the characters and the timelines and all the things that happened, yes, based on church history, but how do you keep all of that in line? I hear that a lot.
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. And let me say this first. After that first book, I was hooked. I liked the idea. And so I had an opportunity to write, again for Bookcraft, a book of 4 short stories. And they were not very thrilled with that in the sense that this is not a typical thing that we publish. But if you're willing to put up half the money to get it printed, and if it sells, then once we get recouped, then we'll, keep going. And it did all right, and they got their money back, but it was not big. So I was thinking I would like to take a shot at fiction. So I had this great idea about crime bosses who were coming up with a whole new way to steal things, and it was a whole thing on that. I wrote it 900 pages, not LDS, sent it off to New York. I can't remember what he called himself. Anyway, he offered to look at people's works. And he wrote back, and I had 7 pages of why this isn't going to work, which was pretty discouraging, by the way. But at the end, he said, if I were you, I would put this aside because I don't think it's salvageable without a tremendous amount of work. But you do have, we think, the possibility of doing it. And so I took that, and one night my wife said to me, Jerry, our daughter Cindy goes to BYU next year. Yes. Just how did you plan to pay for that? And I said, well, actually, I've been really thinking about writing a novel, taking a try at it. And I just can't get a good idea that I really like. And incidentally, for an author, that's where it really starts, to get a concept. And right off, without a minute's hesitation, she said, you love Israel. Why don't you write a book on Israel? And by that point, church education had taken some of us teachers over there, and I did. I fell in love with Israel. And so that was the beginning. Story with the lead character, a young missionary who's frustrated and goes to Israel, and he meets a Jewish girl, and that was my first full novel.
So it seems like when you moved toward the work in the glory and the kingdom and the crown, you started really merging that fiction with the gospel, being able to teach using church history, using experiences that had actually happened, and then setting them in that historical fiction way so that people could access them. What was your thought behind that? Did you just want people to have a better idea and feel for what was going on?
That's another question I'm often asked, is where do you get your ideas? So the first idea was a bummer, obviously, and I saved that for quite a while. And then I read it again. I thought, oh my gosh, you really turned that in.
As all authors do, isn't it, Anne Lamott?
Yeah. So after I did the Israel one, I really liked the novel. And one night I had this horrible nightmare. I couldn't remember what it was all about. The only thing I knew for sure is that I was being forced to do good, to be good. And I couldn't remember how they did it or anything, but that was intriguing. If you were doing good, why would you feel so awful? And that became what authors call the concept. What if you were forced to be good? what does that mean? And that became the novel The Alliance, where we had the implantation in the brain that wouldn't allow you to do anything bad and so on. And so I did 2 more novels after that, really enjoying it. By then, I had been working at Pepperdine on my New Testament master's and was really loving the New Testament. And I decided I wanted to write a novel on the story of Jesus. I called it The Kingdom and the Crown. I was 3 or 4 chapters into it. By now, I'm back in Salt Lake working in the church education system as an administrator. And one day my boss called me in and he said, we have a donor to church education who would like to come out to meet with you and talk about working with you and doing a book on church history. And I said, well, yeah, I've thought about that, but I've already started. I'm working on a New Testament book now. And he said, well, would you just listen to him? I said, not really, because why make him come all the way out here when I'm going to tell him no, because I'm actually working on this book. And then about a week later, he called. He said, he really wants to come out and just talk to you. He said, you don't have to commit to anything, but he really wants to talk to you. So anyway, he came out and I was very impressed. He was convert to the church, he and his wife. And he said, I love historical fiction. And we came through Salt Lake City back in 1947. And they had a little book, kind of a thumbnail sketch of church history. And though they weren't members, he said, that really intrigued me. It was an amazing story. So down the road, missionaries come to his house. Takes him almost a year, but eventually he and his wife joined the church. Now, I told him, here's where I am when I finish this, but it may be more than 1 volume, but when I finish, I'd be happy to look at this. And he said, look, I feel very strongly about this. Would you at least take some time and pray about it? I said, okay, yeah, that's fair. In fact, and this, I got this from my dad, whenever we ran into a problem, he'd take a day off and go up in the mountains and fast and pray. So that was kind of my model. And so I said, I'll do that. I'll take next Saturday, I'll go up in the mountains with my scriptures and fast about it. And when I came down later that night, I called him and said, okay, we're on. Can't believe I'm saying this, but the answer is yes. You can't say the Lord doesn't have a sense of humor, because that was Saturday. That next morning, I got a call from the stake president asking me to come in and meet with him.
Oh my.
And I thought maybe he's, questioned about my class or something. Instead, he called me to be a bishop.
Oh.
That's the next day. I can remember wanting to look up and going, what?
Seriously?
You just told me to do this book. But that's where it began. And one of the things I told him is this is going to take a lot of research, because we're not writing a fictional story about church history. We're writing the church history story with fictional people in it. And that's a very different thing. Exactly. And he was totally committed to that. So he said, I'll pay research, I'll pay travel if you have to. And so we took a year and began to lay it all out and so on. I was naive enough to say that this will be 1 volume. About halfway through the research, I said, it's going to be a big volume, probably 800 or 900 pages. If somebody had said it's going to be 9 volumes.
9 volumes, yeah. Give or take, right? It's close.
Yeah.
I love this story, and I love those that are listening, hearing the evolution of this, of you starting and then getting a rejection, and then still moving forward because you feel the feel to keep doing. And then even opportunities that come that you're like, I really don't want that. I have this great, awesome plan here. And then the things that the Lord wants you to do, and you continually being able to go, okay, I'm going to go on that path. Okay, yes, I will go down that road. Yeah. And watching what happened. And can't even imagine how much everybody's testimonies have been strengthened, especially with church history, through that series of The Work and the Glory. And I know for The Kingdom and the Crown, I've read it repeatedly, those 3 big, thick books. And I have learned so much. And that was a quick question I wanted to ask you too. That's a fine line, having to decipher what is history and what is true church history, and then what happens with the characters to make it, ameliorated into the story. And I know for Kingdom and the Crown, I loved at the end where you would have at the end of the chapter those chapter notes, and you would share things like salarium, is the base word for salt, and that was the currency that they were paid, and the legionnaires were paid, and then so many things just started making sense for me. Well, how did you keep that delineation between true church history and the fictional characters?
Well, here's another, as I thought back on my career, why I loved writing so much. We lived on a little lane in Murray. My family was the last one to get television. My dad was a smelter worker. So in all of my growing up years, we did two things. Every Saturday morning, we went to the Murray Theater and watched the serials, the comedies or the comics, and a movie. But all through the year, we'd go to the library and come back with just arms full of books. My dad was an interesting person. Every night he would come home, and after dinner, he would say to my mom, "Evelyn, the time's yours. I'll take the kids now." And eventually that was 5, and he did that all of our growing up years. And what he did is he read to us. And so between my reading and his reading, I don't know how many thousands of books, or hundreds at least. But that's where I think I got embedded the concept of how to tell a story. But in the case of The Work and the Glory, one of the first things I said to Kim was, I don't have to make up a story that's going to be gripping. This story is amazing. Interestingly enough, and I wrote this in volume 4th or 5th in the preface, Kim and his wife were having dinner. And his wife said, "Kim, tell Jerry why you felt so compelled, why you wouldn't give up bugging him." And he told me this story. He said, "I had this feeling to get this book written. So I actually started reading church history and started to write a novel." And he said, very quickly it became evident that that was not going to work. And his wife said, "Boy, that was for sure." She said it was awful.
Only a wife can say.
And then he said, one night after I'd tried it and didn't work, and I went to sleep, and while I was sleeping, I had a dream. And in my dream, a man was standing at the foot of my bed. And he said to me, "Kim, why haven't you got that story about the creation of the church done?" And he said, I protested and said, "Well, I tried to write it, and I'm not a writer." And this personage said, "I never said you had to write it, just get it done." And he said, "If you don't," he said, "you're getting old." By this point, he was 73, I think. And he said, "You never know when life will take you, and then it will not be possible for you." And that's why he was so compelled
It's so
to
insistent.
get this done.
Yes.
But from that point, all of this stuff you talked about, the only thing I create fiction in is the characters and how they react. We committed that we would be true to church history, and that was a great thing. I think inspiration from my part, and it's been the case now with every historical book, whether it's church or not. You want to talk about the real storytellers, it's the historians.
Oh my goodness. And same thing for scriptures, right? Even
Yeah.
when they start saying, "I'm not a very good writer, and I wish that I could write like so-and-so." And as an author, I look at that and I think everybody thinks that, but their words and their personality and their voice, that's what comes through, and the spirit can witness the truth of it through that voice.
And that's exactly right. It's the truth of it. And of course, you want them to like their characters. I'm often asked by people, "I'd really like to write a book. What do I do?" And now the first question I always ask them is, "Do you like to write?" I'm surprised how many say, "Well, not really. It's kind of hard." Well, don't do it then. I found one quote that says, "Writing a novel is like being in a Chinese torture chamber. You better love to do it or leave it alone, because it'll drive you crazy." Larry King one night was interviewing Tom Clancy. And he said, "Tom, you have written both fiction and nonfiction, and both are bestsellers. tell us what is the difference for an author in writing those? Without hesitation, Tom said, oh, that's simple. Fiction has to be believable.
These things are so true. I love how you have this way of being able to just go through this whole process, and you just keep this feel about it that's so grounded and so real. I know as an author that, you look back at the first book that you did, and then you look at your most recent book and look at all those books in between, and there's so much personal growth as an author.
No question.
Wrapping up here, I would love to know, does anything come to mind to you or stand out to you as how you have developed or become more as a person? What has shifted for you, or what has developed for you as you've been immersed in this world?
Well, a couple of things. The commitment to telling a good story comes from, we read every one of Tarzan the Jungle and Bomba the Jungle Boy and the Hardy Mystery. I mean, we read all of those series.
Yep.
And bless those authors for it. I love spy and kinds of novels. I love historical novels. James Michener is an astounding author. And so all of that comes into personal experience, but it's very often that I'll be reading something or watching something on a movie or just in a conversation and somebody will say something. I think, oh, I want to use that one. Or I run across some little crazy thing somebody's done. Oh, I know just who to have do that. So in a lot of the fiction, there's more truth to it. I just haven't embarrassed anybody by telling who it describes.
That is a safe course. I think that is a wise path. I think that's beautiful. What would you say, just in those that are listening, that are wanting to move forward on writing? Maybe they're stuck. Maybe they've lost their motivation. Maybe they just don't know if they have what it takes to do this. Is there anything that comes to mind that's a phrase or a principle or something that's helped you to really stay focused on what it is the Lord wants you to do? Something that could help them?
Two things come to mind that hit me. One came from somebody else, so I'll quote it, and you have to give him the credit. One author said, how do you define writing? 3 words, damn hard work. It is. It's cut and polish and go back and redo. And the second thing I came up with myself when young authors come, and after my first question, do you like to write? If they say, yeah, then I say, here's the formula, 6 words. Read, write. And they said, well, what if I'm writing a novel that you can't go out and read something about? I don't care. Just read. Read stories. Read the best authors. Read the storytellers that are master storytellers. And that just starts to get embedded in our system. And then the work comes.
I
Polish.
Love that.
Another famous, I can't even remember his name now. He said, good books are not written, they are rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. That's another classic.
I love that because it makes me think of the scripture in D&C where it says, seek out of the best books. And I've thought about that it's almost like that 10,000 hours principle that's so debatable, but it's not just that you have 10,000 hours of practice. It's that you are practicing good skills. And when you're reading the best books, you are reading well-written literature. You're reading the right structure, the right format, the right things. Jane Austen and Agatha Christie, I kind of laugh because I love reading them because they always are satisfying because of the way that they write. It is very well written.
Exactly. Right? Here's another question I'm often asked by aspiring writers. Where do you get your ideas? And I said, where do you get your food? Where do you get your enjoyment? I've been thinking about something to do with the Constitution. And this friend of mine said, have you ever watched that Tide soap commercial? This was on television 30 years ago. And the commercial was the lady comes and she's in her laundry room. She comes to the upper cabinet. She opens the door and there's nothing in it. And she gasps, somebody stole my Tide. And that's the whole thing. And then this guy opens the back. Oh, no, we didn't. Here's your tide. And she's so thrilled and everything, you know. And I watched that and I thought, what would happen if somebody took away the Constitution? That simple line became the next story. Yeah.
I love it. This is so fun to go into the backstory and see the thoughts and all the things that precede what we see on the shelf and what we bring home. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
This is fun for me.
It's been wonderful. We say that this is a kitchen table experience, and it's felt so much like that, of just sitting with a little cup of cocoa and just chatting and hearing your life experiences.
Right.
Beautiful, prolific author. Thank you so much for being with us, Brother Lund, today.
Thanks for the opportunity. You can tell I love to talk about writing as well as I love to write. So thank you.
I love it. And I know you teach classes and you're able to help people with their writing. If people are listening, and they definitely will want to connect with you, they can reach you on social media, anywhere you look for Gerald Lund and his books, and through his publisher. We are so grateful. We will put it in the show notes for everyone so they'll know the best way to reach out to you and ask any questions or connect with you.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Thank you. This has been pure joy. And thank you for listening. And as always, if you loved these interviews, then go below, rate, review, and subscribe. And if you want other beautiful interviews that will help you on your creative path, Al Caraway, Jenny Oakes Baker, Lisa Valentine Clark, then go and check out the other options that we have for you and enjoy letting us help you on your next step on feeling called to create.